Hello, this is Mike Corrali with the Introduction to United States Government course online. Welcome back. Oh my goodness, where do I start? So when I first began teaching in the 1990s, giving this lecture was pretty straightforward. Some teachers came at it through theories of presidential behavior. Some taught it through events. Others examined the presidency through what we call the great man theory. When I took it, my professor taught it through the lens of the imperial presidency, a very well-known treatise by Arthur Schlesinger. Some taught it through interpretation of traditional political philosophy, some through relations with Congress or through relations with the judiciary. I've heard of a class titled Presidents at War. It sounds very interesting. Heck, one semester I was tempted to try presidential pets. What I was looking for was ways to make this lecture interesting, immediately relevant, academically rigorous, and adhering to the established tenets of political science. Most of all, I was hoping for the student to really understand the institution of the presidency deep down, so that, in future, they could call to mind the aspects that we had defined and apply it to the office holders who might come in the future, perhaps even long after I'd left the planet. To achieve this, I developed my own system, one that I call presidential hats. Well, the mechanism I developed worked for Bill Clinton, it worked for George W. Bush, it worked for Barack Obama, and then we got to Donald Trump. Well, you know by now that I remain strictly nonpartisan and personally non-political in this class. As I've said, my political opinion means nothing. Your well-reasoned, deeply considered opinion means everything. Love him or hate him, the tried-or-true pedagogy that I developed in the 90s seemed to go out the window when Donald Trump came on the scene. I couldn't quite make it work. To illustrate, one of my favorite internet memes is a guy beating his head against a wall with the caption, "I'd like to go one day without hearing the word unprecedented." Indeed. Well, after the Trump administration ended, I sat down and had a long, hard look at how I taught this course. How does one even begin to address what's transpired in our nation and with the presidency in those 4 years? How can I begin to do it justice in the context of a 3-hour lecture? Well, as we discussed in our examination of political parties and campaigns and elections, even the Republican Party seemed to have gotten into the act by not establishing a party platform in 2020, rather just dusting off that from 2016. Where do you go with that? After much soul-searching, I realized that my presidential hats model still works. It needs to be much more in-depth in certain areas in order to get at how the presidency has changed, what remains the same, and what our hopes for the future might be. So this lecture is again a mixture of in-class recording and dictated material. There's much more dictated material in this recording than usual because, as I say, so much has changed. What was true when I made that in-class recording not that long ago has changed so significantly as to demand this significant updating. Okay, well, with that caveat and disclaimer in mind, we proceed to our examination of the United States presidency. I hope you enjoy this lecture, and I do look forward to reading your essays. Let's go. I'm very excited about today's lecture. This is actually my favorite lecture of the entire American government class, and it has to do with the presidency and bureaucracy. This is dealing with chapters in Bard's et al. American Government and Politics Today, which is our basic text for this class. For further research, I'm also going to be using 2 other books that I happen to write, The Transformation of Global Geopolitics and Trouble at the Border, a contextual approach for the study of immigration policy in the United States. We'll be referring to those as well. So if you wanted to check my facts or do any further research, that'd be where you go. So we have 2 seminar questions. Normally we only have one, but since this is a 2-chapter lecture, we have 2. The first one is, in regards to the presidency specifically, do the disparate roles of the presidency add to or detract from the Madisonian model? And I'll go over this, but we know that the Madisonian model is the balance of power evidenced in the Constitution. Those institutional elements that are in the 3 branches of government, as well as the federal system itself, and the role of the states, and the role of the electorate. So how do the different roles of the presidency add to or detract from that intentional balance of power? And then secondly, does the Iron Triangle, or rather the existence of the Iron Triangle, help or hinder the pluralist ideal? We'll be introducing the Iron Triangle. I know you've done your reading, and I know you've seen that my job is to make it a little more friendly and to describe it and explain it in a little more fullness. But the pluralist ideal, we know now, we should have this well under our belt. That is the vibrant marketplace of ideas that Jefferson referred to. This idea that the more voices, the better. The richer, the fuller the conversation, the more ideas you can get into a piece of legislation, the better off that piece of legislation is going to be, the more useful it's going to be. So again, just very quickly, our first seminar question is the disparate roles of the presidency, and how do they add to or detract from the Madisonian model. But before we go there, let's talk about you for a minute. Here you are on a beautiful Saturday morning, right? The world is going on out there, the sun is shining, the birds are chirping, and yet here you are. And so you're here by virtue of being a student, right? And so it's pretty simple of me to ask, how many people in here are students? Right, okay, good, thank you. So how many people in here have a job in addition to being a student? Everybody, not surprising. Okay, how many people in here have a family of some sort? Okay, very good. How many people, you see where I'm going with this, right? How many people in here volunteer your time in any way? Wow, pretty much everybody. How many people in here go to a church? I don't care what church. How many people in here go to a church? Okay, how many people in here have friends? Very good, excellent. Okay, how many people in here go to the gym? Okay. How many people in here pay your own bills, do your own check writing? All right. How many people in here perform your own maintenance on your car? Do you wash your car? Do you vacuum your apartment or your house? You do your own dishes? All right, okay. All right, so you see where I'm going with this. What we're talking about is how many hats you wear. Now, this is kind of blithe, you see where I'm going, but how many times has being a student impacted your ability to be an employee? How many times have you had to miss work because you've had to go to school? Or how many times have you had to miss school because you've had to go to work? Anybody? Yeah, a lot of times? Okay. How many times have you had to miss important family functions because of being a student? You've had to miss perhaps performances or birthday parties, right? Okay. How many people in here have had to miss the gym because you had to get up and go to school in the morning, right? You couldn't go to the gym, I'd rather be there myself. Okay. Now, those are how your hats then combine to limit your capabilities, limit your effectiveness. That you're less an effective student because you have to work, that you're less an effective worker because you have to go to school. But then how many times has being a student perhaps and a family member combined to help you? How many times have you had dinner ready for you when you get home from class? How many times has somebody else done something that helped you be a student? They supported you. Let's say even, I'm not seeing a lot of heads nodding yet, this is scary. Even philosophically, how many people have said, good for you, right? Go get your degree. Good for you. I'm here to support you. I'm here to help you. So being a family member then combines and helps you. How many times have you been able to work on homework while you're at work? Yeah, I did all the time. Okay, so what we're looking at then is how your different hats, now albeit we agree, we all wear many different hats. And they can combine to help us or to limit us in our effectiveness in any one of those areas of our life. Okay, so that's really what we're looking at in today's lecture, are the different hats that the president wears and how they combine to help or hinder the president in affecting his or her office. All right, first then, let's have a little fun, if you don't mind. A little fun is always a good way to start a Saturday morning. Yeah? This thing's on, right? You guys are awake? You want some Red Bull? Yeah, okay. In your mind, what customs, what conveyances, what regalia, music, etc., recall in your mind the Queen of England. Now, going back to our first class together when we were talking about the Declaration of Independence, and we went far back into the history of the kings and queens of England, we got a sense of this notion that the Queen or the King is a head of state, that they are the patriotic focus of attention in the country. So what we're looking at then is, in your minds as Americans, being far removed from the British Empire or the British monarchy, we still know well enough about the kings and queens of England to answer this question. So some of your responses might include, does anybody know this edifice? Buckingham Palace, right, with Queen Victoria's monument sitting there in front built by George. Buckingham Palace, the Queen's official residence in London. Anybody know Windsor Castle? The idea that the king or the queen has a palace, has a castle, a place to retreat to outside the environs of London. This is only, 40 miles out of London. And it is really their home. If you want evidence of this truly being their home, well, the edifice itself was completed by George IV. The skyline that you see of Windsor Castle is actually fairly new. It dates from the early 1800s. It looks a lot older. It was intentionally meant to look a lot older. For example, if you look at this tower on the left, you can see just a small line of difference between the older brick and the newer brick. About halfway up, you see the color of the brick changes. The bricks on top were actually completed by George IV. So the skyline of Windsor Castle is new. The chapel that you see in the lower right is St. George's Chapel, and this is one of the private chapels of the Queen. And what's fun about this, you can't quite see it in this photograph, but there's a lot of people buried in this chapel. Under the slab, just at the beginning of the photo, you have a vault that contains the bodies of Charles I, the one who was beheaded, Henry VIII, and Jane Seymour. You have a number of the more recent monarchs buried under there as well. In the back of the chapel, you have the Prince Albert Memorial Chapel, where Prince Albert was originally laid to rest. You have King George V, you have King George VI, you have the Queen Mum. Remember the Queen Mum? She was 100 plus and she just died she's buried in this. So when I say this is the Queen's home, I mean that because this is where her ancestors, for the great part, are buried. You might think of the Queen's flight. The Queen's flight is the official state transportation, air transportation for the Queen. You have the fixed-wing aircraft, which is the airplane, and that's assigned to the Royal Air Force. You also have the helicopter, and that's assigned to the Queen's household. There are actually two different reporting lines for this. But both the fixed-wing aircraft and the helicopter are known as the Queen's flight. Now, you may remember when Princess Diana died, she was in Paris. And Prince Charles asked the Queen if he couldn't use the Queen's flight to go retrieve the body and to bring her back in style. And the Queen refused. She had to. She felt she had to because Princess Diana was no longer a member of the royal family. And to use the Queen's flight for non-state business was unconstitutional, oddly enough. Now, there was a great uproar, and she eventually relented. Nevertheless, the Queen's flight is the Queen's air transportation on official state business. You may think of the Beefeaters. Right? Now, the Beefeaters are the ones on top. They're the ones with the heraldic Elizabethan costumes. And it's a misnomer to think that they're the Palace Guard. The Palace Guard are the guys who wear the bearskin hats, the really tall canonical hats that stand out front of Buckingham Palace. They're often conflated. They're often confused. So I just wanted to clear this up because they're both parts of the Queen's personal guard. Now, the yeoman warders, the Beefeaters, the ones in the heraldic Elizabethan outfits, actually guard the Tower of London and the Crown Jewels, whereas the Queen's Guard, the Palace Guard, the ones with the bearskin hat, protect the body of the Queen when she's in residence. Really, who's the security for the Queen? I mean, a bunch of guys running around in bearskin hats, they're pretty to look at, surely, they're historic, but they're not really going to do the job. You have Scotland Yard, or what's called the Royal Protection Squad. They also call them the bullet catcher, oddly enough. And this is part of the Metropolitan Police, or the Royalty and Diplomatic Protection Department of Scotland Yard, M1 and M5. So Scotland Yard as protection for the Queen. So the national anthem of the United Kingdom. I'm not sure if anybody's ever heard it. Sound familiar? Does the tune sound familiar? My country, 'tis of thee. Right? All right. So the national anthem of Great Britain is actually an ode to the Queen. Since the Queen is sovereign, it's not surprising that the loyalty, the fealty, goes not to the Constitution or to the nation, but to the Queen individually. How about state events? When you think of the Queen, perhaps the Queen launching ships. In her reign, she's launched 23 ships. There is a wonderful photograph here in the upper right of her attending Diana's funeral, cutting a ribbon, opening a hospital. And in the lower left is really an historic photograph. This is the Queen visiting Dublin Trinity College. And this is the Irish state harp. This is the harp that's pictured on Irish currency. And it was a big deal for the Queen to visit Ireland as head of state in a state visit, a country that she used to own. So this is a huge deal. It's a state event. So when we think of the Queen, we might think of state events. What about meeting foreign dignitaries? The Queen has met 12 presidents, the only exception being Lyndon Johnson. And I'll talk about that in a little bit. She's made 261 overseas visits and 96 state visits. She's very, very hardworking. We see this wonderful photograph of her with Eisenhower in the upper left. This is President Eisenhower. So he was president when she came to the throne. And then we show to the right her and President Obama. So this is the span of this woman's reign. But then she's also met leaders such as Pope John Paul II, President Bush, President Clinton, meeting foreign dignitaries. You might think of awarding medals and investing knighthoods. So here we have the Queen dubbing, anybody recognize this guy? Sean Connery, exactly. The Queen has given out more than 400,000 medals in her reign. You might think of state dinners. Check this out. That's a nice dinner, right? When the Queen, acting as head of state, welcomes and hosts other heads of states on state visits, then it's usually capped with a state dinner. Perhaps opening Parliament comes to mind. So this is the Queen's first opening of Parliament. This is when she calls her government together and she goes to the Houses of Parliament. She goes to Westminster and she sits in the joint houses, the House of Lords and the House of Commons, and she opens her government in her name by her authority. Doing this for a reason. You'll follow me in a minute. Now remember that the Queen, according to the 1689 Act of Settlement, when opening Parliament is given a speech. And although she can advise and warn her ministers on important political issues, once given the speech, she can't change anything in it. So she's given a speech to read to open her parliament in her nation. She's sovereign, but that she can't so much change a word in the speech that she's given. Interesting. Opening Parliament. An exceptional art collection. So the exceptional art collection that we're dealing with then is a vast collection of art that is the sum total of kings and queens for millennia. There's an edifice called the Queen's Gallery. This was the Duke of Edinburgh's idea, the Queen's husband's idea. It was created in 1962 to allow the public an opportunity to come in and see some of the Queen's art collection. What about the media's focus on the human side? Now, they don't pick on the Queen as much as they pick on perhaps Prince Charles, but they do like to focus on the human side. They like to remind people that the Queen is human. There's nothing more human than loving animals or having pets, right? And so the focus on the human side includes the focus on the Queen's love, in this case, of her dogs and her horses. Did you know that the Queen actually developed a breed of dog called the Dorgie? She personally bred one of her corgis to her sister Margaret's Dachshunds and came up with a new breed called a Dorgie. It's not very popular, but there you have it. The Queen got her first dog when she was 18. Its name was Susan, and most of the 30 dogs that she's had since she's been queen are descendants of Susan, that original corgi. You may think of the coronation when you think of the Queen. The setting aside, the making sacred of the person of the Queen, creating her sovereign. We talked about this in Chapter 1, and the process by which, through the anointing, the body of the Queen is physically made sacred. And we talked about Michelle Obama in her last state visit, casually, lovingly, we know Michelle Obama putting her hand on the Queen's shoulder, and that the media just went ape because you don't touch the Queen. Even if it's loving and well-intended, you don't touch the Queen. And this is a result of the coronation ceremony where the Queen's body is actually sanctified, is set apart. With very rare exception, the coronations are held in Westminster Abbey. Westminster Abbey being the Queen's own peculiar church, the monarchy uses it for most personal, family, and public state occasions. They also use St. Paul's, but for the most part they use Westminster Abbey. So if you're thinking weddings, state funerals, or coronations, it's Westminster Abbey. The Queen takes an oath during her coronation, promising in 3 ways to govern the people of the United Kingdom, to cause law and justice and mercy to be executed in all her judgments, and then the third, to protect the church, because remember, the Queen is also the head of the Church of England. And so by head of the Church of England, she has to swear that she is going to preserve the bishops and clergy of England and the churches they're committed to their charge, such all rights and privileges as by law or shall appertain to any of them. So this dates from, as we remember, Henry VIII. The Queen is the head of the Church of England. Now, as a side note, becoming a British citizen, the oath that you take is an oath of fealty to the Queen. And so the oath to become a citizen of the United Kingdom, I swear by Almighty God that on becoming a British citizen I will be faithful and bear true allegiance to Her Majesty, Queen Elizabeth II, her heirs and successors according to law. So the oath to become a citizen is actually an oath to the Queen. What about her portrait on coinage? When we think of the Queen, perhaps we think of currency in the Commonwealth, on which her portrait is predominant, because it is her money. The money is put out in her name and by her authority. It is her currency. Another good example of this is the Queen is the only person in the United Kingdom who could drive without a driver's license. Why? Because driver's licenses are established in her name, and she can't give herself a driver's license. So she's the only one in the UK who can drive without a license. On a somber note, the idea of lying in state. This is the Queen's grandfather's state funeral, George V. And lying in state then, usually in the Houses of Parliament or in Westminster Hall. You may think of the HMS Britannia, the Queen's private yacht. It's a museum now. It was decommissioned. It was deemed to be rather too expensive and too extravagant. And so the Queen took a trade with the Queen's flight and bumping up the Queen's flight and letting go of HMS Britannia. So now it's a museum in Edinburgh, Scotland. So if you're ever in Scotland, you can take a tour of it. All right, you've given me 20 minutes to have my fun. Now, there's a method to my madness, and you knew it. I wouldn't do anything so blithely, right? Now we switch gears to the President of the United States. Do you see any correlations? Obviously, right? And so Buckingham Palace becomes the White House, right? First built during the administration of John Adams. Poor guy moved in when there was no furniture, no heat, and Abigail was back in Quincy. She wouldn't want to move with him, and so he lived there as a bachelor for the first couple of years. Buckingham Palace becomes the White House. Windsor Castle, the idea of a country retreat, becomes, in this instance, Camp David in Maryland. Camp David was established in 1942. It was originally called Shangri-La. It was renamed Camp David by Dwight Eisenhower in honor of his grandson, David Eisenhower. It was a works public administration project. In other words, it was a New Deal project to give needful employment to local craftsmen, artisans in the area. The Queen's flight becomes Air Force One. All right. And so Air Force One is actually the call number of any plane, as you know, that the president happens to be on. So the president, as long as it's a fixed-wing aircraft, if the president's on it, it's called Air Force One. But we know that there are actually 2 planes that serve as predominantly Air Force One. Originally in 1943 until 1953, the code name was, get this, Sacred Cow. So I don't know how I like that. So they changed it to Air Force One. There's a lot of trivia to be had for Air Force One. It's fascinating. My favorite piece is that its range is 6,000 miles to go unfueled. That's an amazing aircraft. Marine One is the helicopter that serves the president, usually going to and from Andrews Air Force Base from the White House. So it's owned and operated by the Marines. There's only been one time in history when we've had a Navy one, and that was when George W. Bush went from NAS Coronado out to the carrier floating off Southern California to proclaim mission accomplished. And so that was the one time we had the call Navy One. The Beefeaters become the Marine Sentries. Now, the Marine Sentries are a subset of the United States Marine Guard. So these guys are often called the Marine Guard. It's actually a misnomer. The Marine Guard protects embassies and ambassadors. The Marine Sentries are 4 guys who are always in attendance at the White House, specifically at the West Wing, when the president is present. Scotland Yard becomes the Secret Service. And so this was established in 1865, and it's to provide protection for national and visiting leaders. The Secret Service was one of the nation's oldest federal investigative law enforcement agencies, founded in 1865 as a branch of the Treasury Department. It was originally created to combat counterfeiting U.S. currency. A lot of you have heard this, a serious problem at the time. But in 1901, following the assassination of President William McKinley in Buffalo, New York, the Secret Service was first tasked with its second mission, the protection of the president. And so today the Secret Service mission is twofold: protection of the president, vice president, and others, and investigations against financial infrastructure of the United States. And so they protect the president, the vice president, the immediate families of the above individuals, former presidents, children of former presidents until they turn 16, visiting heads of foreign states or governments and their spouses traveling with them, any other distinguished foreign visitors, major presidential and vice presidential candidates and their spouses within 120 days of a general election, and then any other individuals as assigned by the Department of the Treasury. So the United States Secret Service serves the function of Scotland Yard, and if the Queen gets a song, hey, so does the President. Does this sound familiar? At all? No? I have a little history on that coming up in about 10 minutes, but that's the song that's played when the president enters the room. In the beginning, there are 4 ruffles and 4 flourishes. So a flourish is a bugle call. A ruffle is a drum call. And so before the president enters the room, there's the combination of the bugles and the drums 4 times doing a roll, the flourishes. And so that is assigned to the president. The number of flourishes and ruffles you get is an indication of your office, believe it or not. And they didn't just make this up. This is Army Regulations 600.25. And so the Army is establishing the rules of when and how Hail to the Chief is played. What about meeting foreign dignitaries? State visits. So here we have President and Mrs. Obama with Queen Elizabeth and the Duke of Edinburgh. We have President Reagan meeting Mikhail Gorbachev. We have President George W. Bush meeting Benedict XVI. What about sporting events? The president attending sporting events. We have FDR throwing the first baseball of the Red Sox game at Fenway in 1933. We have President Bush congratulating the Boston Red Sox for the 2004 World Series championship. And then President Obama, although he's a White Sox fan, begrudgingly calling Boston Red Sox manager John Farrell to congratulate his team's victory in the 2013 World Series.
As we'll discuss further on in this lecture, sadly, this tradition of the president participating in sporting events like this has become, sadly, very politicized, where teams refuse or players refuse to go to the White House to accept the congratulations of the president, or the president is rather disinvited from participating in throwing out first pitches, etc. Very sad, but as I mentioned, we'll be talking about that more as we continue in our lecture, starting to compare and contrast different presidencies.
What about awarding medals? We think of the president then as awarding medals. So here we have Calvin Coolidge in the upper left. We have President Kennedy, who we're going to talk a lot about today. We have President Johnson. But then we have President Clinton with this lovely, beautiful woman in the pink. Anybody know who she is? Rosa Parks, right? And this is the president giving Rosa Parks the Presidential Medal of Freedom. And so the Presidential Medal of Freedom is given by the president, and the awardees are designated by the president. All other medals are designated by Congress, and the president gives them at Congress's authority. But this is the one that the president gets to choose who gets. And so it's for individuals who have made especially meritorious contributions to the security or national interests of the United States, to world peace, or to cultural or other significant public or private endeavors. And so they cover arts, business, computing, education, history, humanitarianism, medicine, philanthropy, philosophy, political activities in government, religion, science, sociology. And so arts include film and music. So some of the more popular ones that you may know who have received the Medal of Freedom would be Bob Dylan. How about Andy Griffith? Somebody even bigger than Bill Clinton. Way bigger. Oprah. Oprah got her Medal of Freedom. And the president got a lot of heat for it. Why would she get a Medal of Freedom? What has she done? Well, it's up to the president's discretion. This is the president's award. And there is no review. There is no committee that's helping him make those decisions. So the Presidential Medal of Freedom. Okay, what about hosting state dinners? So the Chief Protocol Office, which is part of the White House office, helps the president host state dinners, just as Queen Elizabeth did in Windsor Castle. And I have some just quick examples of some of the more interesting state dinners that the president has hosted. But first, the White House state dinner isn't like a traditional dinner party. They're bigger and better than most weddings, and invitations are considered to be the hottest ticket in town. These lavish celebrations honoring a visiting head of government are some of the most glamorous affairs hosted by the White House and have been a tradition since the 19th century, when President Grant hosted the first ever state dinner, complete with a 29-course meal. So I give you the Obama State Dinner for China in January of 2011. This is from the White Protocol Officer's website. Dressed in a flaming red Alexander McQueen dress, First Lady Michelle Obama pulled out all the stops for this 2011 Obama State Dinner in honor of the Chinese president. An all-American menu featuring dishes like D'Anjou Paris salad with fresh goat cheese, poached Maine lobster, dry-aged ribeye with buttermilk crisped onions. Sounds delicious. What about Bush State Dinner for Queen Elizabeth in May 2007? At the end of a 6-day trip to the United States, the Queen's 5th trip, she and Prince Philip were treated to a visit to Washington unlike any other. The day began with a 21-gun salute and a parade attended by nearly 7,000. I think of HMS Britannia when it's afloat and when the Queen was on board, when it was still commissioned, was considered a piece of sovereign British soil. In other words, when Britannia is floating along the ocean and the Queen's on it, it's considered a piece of British soil. Imagine a little piece of England breaking off and going floating across the Atlantic. So when the Queen visited and conducted a state visit when Ronald Reagan was president, the president hosted the Queen and the Duke of Edinburgh at the White House for a huge, lavish state dinner. And then, because the Queen had HMS Britannia, she was able to reciprocate. A head of state can only have a state visit, host a state visit on sovereign soil. That makes sense? You're not going to have a state visit in a country that isn't yours. So she was able to host the president and Nancy Reagan in New York Harbor. And it was a huge deal. It was very successful. So the president then, as head of state, hosting state dinners. Opening Parliament becomes the State of the Union address. And so the State of the Union address is required, a report to Congress by the president is required in the Constitution. Giving the Congress an update as to the State of the Union on a regular basis is one of the constitutionally required duties of the president. We'll talk about that anon. How the president decides to deliver that is up to the president. There is no obligation for the president, constitutionally, to address a joint session of Congress. As a matter of fact, George Washington, in dealing with the Senate over a treaty, got so upset at the Senate that he refused really to enter their chambers again. And it wasn't until 1916 and Woodrow Wilson that the president actually delivered the State of the Union address in person. Between 1788 and 1916, the State of the Union address was delivered in an envelope. And so the use of the State of the Union address as a political tool, as the president acting as chief citizen, and I'll talk about these different hats in a little bit, using this bully pulpit, this media-grabbing event, this attention-grabbing event, the State of the Union address, to lay out his legislative agenda for the next year. So the opening of Parliament serves the same purpose as the State of the Union address. It's the same function, to gather together the legislative houses in a joint session, to have the monarch, or in this instance, the head of government, outline the next year's legislative agenda. Now, the difference is who gets to write the speech. Right? With the Queen, the Parliament, the government, is giving her, as head of state, the speech to read. So it's more of an honorific event. With the President, though, he is really outlining his legislative agenda. And he's using the State of the Union address as a media-grabbing opportunity to get the public behind him. The focus on the human side, just like with the Queen. So you have President Obama playing basketball. You have Ronnie Baby there doing moose antlers. And anybody see what's going on with George W.? Anybody know this photograph? It's pretty famous. He's got the lens caps on.
Oh, yeah.
Oh, yeah. Oops. Wow. So focus on the human side, the foibles of the presidency. And I wasn't going to let the Queen have dogs and not let the President have pets, right? And so now we have him and her, which were the beagles owned by Lyndon Johnson, and in this instance, Socks the cat. That was Chelsea Clinton's cat. Now, this is an interesting little side note. You'll note on the bottom, there's a picture of Lyndon Johnson picking up one of his beagles by the ears. And he insisted that the beagles loved it. And it got them to yap and to yelp. Naturally, they would yap and they would yelp. But F. Lyndon Baines Johnson, well, they just saw the world a little differently. And so he knew that his beagles loved it. The press corps ate it up, and the country railed against Lyndon Johnson, especially the animal lovers. And he had to quit it. So you'll see on the cover of Life magazine, him and her. I like to show this picture of Socks the cat. He's such a little cutie. But photographers capturing photographs of Socks. He's just sitting there being a cat, and he has, the paparazzi. This is the focus on the human side. Right? Why would we care so much about a cat? Because it's the president's cat, and people love that stuff. The inauguration. Now, we don't have the religious connotations to the inauguration, but it is an event that's constitutionally required by the oath of office, by the president needing to take the oath of office. It's held at the Temple of Justice and Faith, which is Jefferson's name for the Capitol, for the U.S. Capitol. And so it is our secular temple. It is our secular church. It's intended to look like a cathedral. It's intended to look like a church. This is Abraham Lincoln's second inaugural on the steps of the yet uncompleted U.S. Capitol building. The important thing is the presidential oath, and that the presidential oath is taken. I do solemnly swear or affirm that I will faithfully execute the office of President of the United States and will, to the best of my ability, preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution. This is Article 2, Section 1, Clause 8. You'll notice that it doesn't say, "So help me God." George Washington added, "So help me God." And it's been traditional for presidents to follow George Washington's lead ever since. The citizenship oath, just as we looked at the citizenship oath of a British citizen, the citizenship oath for the United States has, in part, to support and defend the Constitution of the United States against all enemies. So whereas in the British system, you're giving your allegiance to the person of the Queen, the sovereign of the Queen, in a republic, we know that the people are sovereign through the Constitution. And so to support and defend the Constitution, being the oath of citizenship of the United States, is evidence of our being a republic. Just as a side note, I think it's important to bring. Portraits on coinage, an exceptional art collection in the White House. What about lying in state? So this is in the rotunda of the Capitol, and this is, sadly, JFK, lying in state in the rotunda of the Capitol. HMS Britannia becomes, well, any number of presidential yachts. So this was Franklin Roosevelt and Harry Truman's yacht. There have been others. The Mayflower that Teddy Roosevelt used, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. There was the Williamsburg from 45 to 53, and the Sequoia, a second one, from 33 to 77. But what's so cool about the Potomac is it's in Jack London Square, down in Oakland. You can rent it, and you can take it out on the bay, and you can have a dinner party on it. It's very interesting, but it's an amazingly well-kept, well-preserved museum, the USS Potomac. Okay, so thank you for allowing me that, but I think I've done my job. What we're looking at then is the idea of the president as head of state. And so a head of state acts as one person, one individual, or a focus for national unity. They're a center for patriotic loyalty and a national figurehead. So I challenge you to remember great times of jubilation in our country, when the astronauts landed on the moon, when we won World War II, when we won World War I, when there's times of great celebration, great jubilation, where do people flock? They don't flock to the Capitol. They flock to the White House. They flock to the lawn in front of the White House. And this is by virtue of the president being head of state, being this figure, this focus, this lightning rod for patriotic loyalty, a national figurehead. So it's human nature to seek a parent. It's human nature to seek that one person who will lead us, that one person who represents us. And 535 members of Congress simply won't do. Although Congress is intended to be the premier branch of government, we know that. We've talked about that a number of times. You can't have 535 members acting as a head of state, nor will it do in foreign affairs. When you're a foreign country and you're wanting to create a treaty or you're wanting to conduct relations with another country, conducting with 535 members of Congress is like herding cats. It's not going to work. You need a person, one person to conduct state affairs. Now, if non-political, if the head of state is non-political, they can act as the representative for an entire country without risking the possibility of linking national identity with political identity. And so the Queen, as head of state, and then the Prime Minister as head of government are two different functions. They're two different hats. The Queen, by constitutional mandate, has to remain non-political, which is why she can't so much change a word in her speech, right? When she can't make political statements, she has to remain non-political because being head of state, she's meant to represent the entire nation, not linking national identity to political identity. A head of government, like her prime minister, can't by nature represent an entire nation because they are defined by being one political view or having one political view. That is the nature of being a head of government. You are representing a political view, in a democracy especially. So these titles are often used interchangeably. If you have the head of state and the head of government, those are the hats, those are the idea. Then what you call them or what titles they hold are interchangeable. For example, you have Dmitry Medvedev in Russia, who is the prime minister. And as prime minister, he is head of state. You have Vladimir Putin, who is the president, and as president, he is head of government. But if anybody knows contemporary Russian political history, it wasn't that long ago that Putin was prime minister and Dmitry was president. And before that, Dmitry was prime minister and Putin was president. So they've switched back and forth 3 times now, right, between head of state and head of government. Now, the term prime minister and president, then, as I suggest, aren't linked to the idea of head of state or head of government because in Israel, you have Benjamin Netanyahu as prime minister, and as prime minister, he is head of government. And Shimon Peres, as president of the state of Israel, is head of state. So again, the idea of president, prime minister isn't linked to head of state, head of government. They're interchangeable. It's the idea of the hats that I'm after, that there is a head of government that is distinct from a head of state. Queen Elizabeth is a head of state. And so in the United States political system, we have to remember that all our political powers rise from the Constitution. That the president, the legislature, the judiciary get their powers directly from the Constitution. As they're listed in the Constitution, powers are institutional. In other words, the enumerated powers in Article 1, Section 8, the enumerated powers of Congress, those are institutional powers. The leadership of the House and of the Senate, the Speaker of the House, the President of the Senate, those are institutional characteristics because they're in the Constitution. In other words, think of it this way. If the institutional characteristics are foundational, if the Constitution is foundational, then upon a foundation, you build a structure. And so then there are structural elements that arise from the institutional elements. For example, in Congress in Chapter 10, you give Congress the power to make all legislation. All legislative powers herein granted shall be vested in of Congress. Those are the institutional characteristics. How they create legislation, the committee structure, filibuster, right? We've heard a lot about that this week, and cloture. Those are structural elements because they rise from the foundation. You can make law, institutional characteristic. A structural characteristic are the committees by which they make law. And then you have processes, and processes are the conflation of institutional and structural elements that evolve into procedural elements. So if you have, in this instance, Congress having the ability to make law, they do that through the committee structure, then the process by which they make law is the conflation of the institutional and structural characteristics. So that is the process by which they make law. So, in the U.S. political system, then the president is head of state, and this is, as I'm going to suggest, an element of institutional, structural, and procedural element. By virtue of both institutional and structural elements, and procedural elements that arise from the combination of institutional and structural elements, the president is perceived as the head of state. The president's role as head of state, however, is only one aspect of the office, and it's balanced by many other institutional, structural, and procedural elements as well. I have two examples for you. First is Truman in the 1940s, who in his State of the Union address of 1953 said that the president is chief of state, elected representative of all the people, national spokesman for them and to them. He is commander-in-chief of our armed forces. He is charged with the conduct of our foreign relations. He is chief executive of the nation's largest civilian organization, the bureaucracy. He must select and nominate all top officials of the executive branch and all federal judges. And on the legislative side, he has the obligation and the opportunity to recommend, to approve, or to veto legislation. Besides all this, it is to him that a great political party naturally turns for leadership, and that, too, he must provide as president. He then went on to say, Truman, "This bundle of burdens is unique. There is nothing else like it on the face of the earth. Each task could be a full-time job. Together, they would be a tremendous undertaking in the ease." So the president then, relying on institutional, structural, and procedural elements that create him head of state, is going to fall into what Thomas Carlyle in the 1840s suggested was the great man theory. The history of the world is but a biography of great men. That heroes shape history through their personal attributes and divine inspiration. The question then, as we're going to pose today, are presidents great men, and do they shape the times, or do the times shape them? Is it the Civil War that shaped Abraham Lincoln, or did Abraham Lincoln provide the leadership to get through the Civil War? FDR and the New Deal. Then you think Nixon and Watergate. The great man theory, the 1840s, Thomas Carlyle. How powerful is the U.S. president really? If you're looking at the great man theory, really, how powerful is he? Again, we're going to need to look at institutional, structural, and procedural elements of the presidency to ascertain that.
Okay, so we've done a really good job of looking at the president as head of state. But forget for a minute everything you know about the presidency, everything that we've just talked about. Dismiss all the familiar trappings. Forget the White House, the Oval Office, the Rose Garden, the podium with the presidential seal. Let go of the image of the commander-in-chief bounding down the steps of Air Force One to be greeted by adorable flower girls or tossing a salute to generals, their chests dripping with medals. Forget Camp David weekends and motorcades with Secret Service guys in Ray-Bans talking into their wristwatches. Set aside the awesome powers of the job. Take away the football, that legendary briefcase that holds the nuclear launch codes that can obliterate the planet. Shut down the doors of the cabinet. Now check out your notions of how long the chief executive serves, or how America's president gets elected. Dismiss more than 200 years of images of inaugurals and ceremonial wreath-laying.
toss it all into the dustbin of history. Okay, now, sit down with your yellow pad and pencil and try this question or this challenge on for size. How would you remake the presidency? Would you make the job more or less powerful? Would you split the job up for 2 or 3 people to manage? How long should a president serve? And most important, who should choose the president? The men who sweated in secret meetings during the steamy Philadelphia summer to create the American Constitution and reinvent the government of the United States faced exactly that challenge in those questions. What they came up with, sometimes by default, was a job in an office that most of them, we can probably assume, would now agree is not exactly what they had in mind. A platypus, it has been said, is a duck designed by committee. Perhaps the same thing can be said about the American presidency, a novel idea cooked up behind locked doors and sealed windows in the summer of 1787. So the balance then, or the many hats that the president wears, includes head of state. Now we've talked about that ad nauseum. Now we have to talk about the others. Commander-in-Chief, and we're going to go through these individually. Chief Diplomat, Chief Legislator, Head of Party, Chief Economist, Chief Citizen, Chief Executive, Chief Administrator. We need to go back to Founders' intent just a little bit. Again, what parts of the president's job were institutional? What did the founding generation include in the Constitution? What structures were built on that foundation? What structural elements are included in this list? And then what procedural elements are included in this list? So in order to get at the institutional elements, we have to go to Founders' intent. Founders' intent, we know, are found primarily in the Federalist Papers. This is old hat to you guys by now. You've heard me yammer on about this ad nauseum, so here we go. And so this is Federalist number 69, entitled The Real Character of the Executive. To the people of New York, this is Alexander Hamilton in March 1788, Federalist 69. I proceed now to trace the real characters of the proposed executive as they are marked out in the plan of the convention. This will serve to place in a strong light the unfairness of the representations which have been made in regard to it. The first thing which strikes our attention is that the executive authority, with few exceptions, is to be vested in a single magistrate. This will scarcely, however, be considered as a point upon which any comparison can be grounded. For if, in this particular, there is a resemblance to the King of Great Britain, there is not less a resemblance to the Grand Seigneur, to the Khan of Tartary, to the Man of the Seven Mountains, or to the Governor of New York. That magistrate is to be elected for 4 years, and is to be re-eligible as often as the people of the United States shall think him worthy of their confidence. Obviously, this is before the constitutional amendment limiting presidential terms to 2, following Franklin Roosevelt's unprecedented 4th election to office. I continue. In these circumstances, there is a total dissimilitude between him and the King of Great Britain, who is an hereditary monarch, possessing the crown as a patrimony discernible to his heirs forever. But there is a close analogy between him and a governor of New York, who was elected for 3 years and is re-eligible without limitation or intermission. If we consider how much less time would be requisite for establishing a dangerous influence in a single state than for establishing a like influence throughout the United States, we must conclude that a duration of 4 years for the Chief Magistrate of the Union is a degree of permanency far less to be dreaded in that office than the duration of 3 years for a corresponding office in a single state. The President of the United States would be liable to be impeached, tried, and upon conviction of treason, bribery, other high crimes and misdemeanors, removed from office, and would afterwards be liable to prosecution and punishment in the ordinary course of law. The person of the King of Great Britain is sacred and inviolable. There is no constitutional tribunal to which he is amenable, no punishment to which he can be subjected without involving the crisis of a national revolution. In this delicate and important circumstance of personal responsibility, the President of Confederated America would stand upon no better ground than a governor of New York. and upon worse ground than the governors of Maryland and Delaware. The President of the United States is to have power to return a bill which shall have passed the two branches of the legislature for reconsideration. And the bill so returned is to become a law if, upon that reconsideration, it be approved by 2/3 of both houses. The King of Great Britain, on his part, has an absolute negative on the acts of the two houses of Parliament. The disuse of that power for a considerable time past does not affect the reality of its existence, and is to be ascribed wholly to the Crown's having found the means of substituting influence to authority, or the art of gaining a majority in one or the other of the two houses, to the necessity of exerting a prerogative which could seldom be exerted without hazarding some degree of national agitation. The qualified negative of the President differs widely from this absolute negative of the British sovereign, and tallies exactly with the visionary authority of the Council of Revision of this state, of which the governor is a constituent part. In this respect, the power of the President would exceed that of the governor of New York, because the former would possess singly what the latter shares with the chancellor and judges, but it would be precisely the same with that of the governor of Massachusetts, whose constitution, as to this article, seems to have been the original form from which the convention copied. The President is to be the commander-in-chief of the Army and Navy of the United States and of the militia of the several states when called into actual service of the United States. He is to have power to grant reprieves and pardons for offenses against the United States, except in cases of impeachment, to recommend to the consideration of Congress such measures as he shall judge necessary and expedient, to convene on extraordinary occasions both houses of the legislature and either of them, and in case of disagreement between them with respect to the time of the adjournment, to adjourn them to such time as he shall think proper, to take care that the laws be faithfully executed, and to commission all officers of the United States. In most of these particulars, the power of the President will resemble equally that of the King of Great Britain and of the Governor of New York. The most material points of difference are these. First, the President will have only the occasional command of such part of the militia as the nation as by legislative provision may be called into the actual service of the Union. The King of Great Britain and the Governor of New York have at all times the entire command of the militia within their several jurisdictions. In this article, therefore, the power of the President would be inferior to that of either the monarch or the governor. Second, the President is to be Commander-in-Chief of the Army and Navy of the United States. In this respect, his authority would be nominally the same with that of the King of Great Britain, but in substance much inferior to it. It would amount to nothing more than the supreme command and direction of the military and naval forces, as first General and Admiral of the Confederacy, while that of the British King extends to the declaring of war and to the raising and regulating of fleets and armies, all which, by the Constitution under consideration, would appertain to the legislature. The Governor of New York, on the other hand, is, by the Constitution of the state, vested only with the command of its militia and navy. But the constitutions of several of the states expressly declare their governors to be commander-in-chief, as well as of the army as navy. And it may well be a question whether those of New Hampshire and Massachusetts in particular do not, in this instance, confer larger powers on their respective governors than could be claimed by a President of the United States. Third, the power of the President in respect to pardons would extend to all cases except those of impeachment. The Governor of New York may pardon in all cases, even in those of impeachment, except for treason and murder. Is not the power of the Governor in this article, on a calculation of political consequences, greater than that of the President? All conspiracies and plots against the government which have been matured into actual treason may be screened from punishment of every kind by the interposition of the prerogative of pardoning. If a Governor of New York, therefore, should be at the head of any such conspiracy, until the design has been ripened into actual hostility, he could ensure his accomplices and adherents an entire impunity. A President of the Union, on the other hand, though he may even pardon treason when prosecuted in the ordinary course of law, could shelter no offender in any degree from the effects of impeachment and conviction. Would not the prospect of a total indemnity for all the preliminary steps be a greater temptation to undertake and persevere in an enterprise against the public liberty than the mere prospect of an exemption from death and confiscation, if the final execution of the design upon an actual appeal to arms should miscarry? Would this last expectation have any influence at all when the probability was computed that the person who was to afford that exemption might himself be involved in the consequences of the measure, and might be incapacitated by his agency in it from affording the desired impunity? The better to judge of this matter, it will be necessary to recollect that, by the proposed Constitution, the offense of treason is limited to levying war upon the United States and adhering to their enemies, giving them aid and comfort, and that by the laws of New York it is confined within similar bounds. Fourth, the President can only adjourn the national legislature in the single case of disagreement about the time of adjournment. The British monarch may prorogue or even dissolve the Parliament. The Governor of New York may also prorogue the legislature of the state for a limited time, a power which, in certain situations, may be employed to very important purposes. The President is to have power, with the advice and consent of the Senate, to make treaties, provided 2/3 of the senators present concur. The King of Great Britain is the sole and absolute representative of the nation in all foreign transactions. He can, of his own accord, make treaties of peace, commerce, alliance, and every other description. It has been insinuated that his authority in this respect is not conclusive, and that his conventions with foreign powers are subject to the revision and stand in need of the ratification of Parliament. But I believe this doctrine was never heard of until it was broached upon the present occasion. Every jurist of that kingdom and every other man acquainted with its constitution knows, and as an established fact, that the prerogative of making treaties exists in the Crown in its utmost plenitude, and that the compacts entered into by the royal authority have the most complete legal validity and perfection, independent of any other sanction. The Parliament, it is true, is sometimes seen employing in itself in altering the existing laws to conform them to the stipulations in a new treaty. And this may have possibly given birth to the imagination that its cooperation was necessary to the obligatory efficacy of the treaty. But this parliamentary interposition proceeds from a different cause, from the necessity of adjusting a most artificial and intricate system of revenue and commercial laws to the changes made in them by the operation of the treaty, and of adopting new provisions and precautions to the new state of things to keep the machine from running into disorder. In this respect, therefore, there is no comparison between the intended power of the President and the actual power of the British sovereign. The one can perform alone what the other can do only with the concurrence of the branch of the legislature. It must be admitted that, in this instance, the power of the federal executive could exceed that of the state executive. But this arises naturally from the sovereign power which relates to treaties. If the Confederacy were to be dissolved, it would become a question whether the executives of the several states were not solely invested with that delicate and important prerogative. The President is also to be authorized to receive ambassadors and other public ministers. This, though it has been a rich theme of declamation, is more a matter of dignity than of authority. It is a circumstance which will be without consequence in the administration of the government, and it was far more convenient that it should be arranged in this manner than that there should be a necessity of convening the legislature, or one of its branches, upon every arrival of a foreign minister, though it were merely to take the place of a departed predecessor. The President is to nominate and, with the advice and consent of the Senate, to appoint ambassadors and other public ministers, judges of the Supreme Court, and in general all officers of the United States established by law and whose appointments are not otherwise provided for by the Constitution. The King of Great Britain is emphatically and truly styled the Fountain of Honor. He not only appoints to all offices, but can create offices. He can confer titles of nobility at pleasure. He has the disposal of an immense number of church preferments. There is evidently a great inferiority in the power of the President in this particular to that of the British King. Nor is it equal to that of the Governor of New York, if we are to interpret the meaning of the Constitution of the state by the practice which has obtained under it. The power of appointment is with us lodged in a council composed of the governor and 4 members of the Senate chosen by the Assembly. The governor claims and has frequently exercised the right of nomination and is entitled to a casting vote in the appointment. If he really has the right of nominating, his authority in this respect equal to that of the President and exceeds it in the article of casting the vote. In the national government, if the Senate should be divided, no appointment could be made. In the government of New York, if the council should be divided, the governor can turn the scale and confirm his own nomination. If we compare the publicity which must necessarily attend the mode of appointment by the President and an entire branch of the national legislature with the privacy in the mode of appointment by the governor of New York, closeted in a secret apartment with at most 4 and frequently with only 2 persons, if we at the same time consider how much more easy it must be to influence the number which a council of appointment consists than the considerable number of which the national Senate would consist, we cannot hesitate to pronounce that the power of the chief magistrate of this state in the disposition of offices must, in practice, be greatly superior to that of the chief magistrate of the Union. Hence it appears that, except as to the concurrent authority of the President in the Article of Treaties, it would be difficult to determine whether that magistrate would, in the aggregate, possess more or less power than the Governor of New York. And it appears yet more unequivocally that there is no pretense for the parallel which has been attempted between him and the King of Great Britain. But to render the contrast in this respect still more striking, it may be of use to throw the principal circumstances of dissimilitude into a closer group. The President of the United States would be an officer elected by the people for 4 years. The King of Great Britain is a perpetual and hereditary prince. The one would be amenable to personal punishment and disgrace. The other is sacred and inviolable. The one would have a qualified negative upon the acts of the legislative body. The other has an absolute negative. The one would have a right to command the military and naval forces of the nation. The other, in addition to this right, possesses that of declaring war and of raising and regulating fleets and armies by his own authority. The one would have a concurrent power with a branch of the legislature in the formation of treaties. The other is the sole possessor of the power of making treaties. The one would have a like concurrent authority in appointing to offices. The other is the sole author of all appointments. The one can confer no privileges whatever. The other can make denizens of aliens, noblemen of commoners, can erect corporations with all the rights incident to corporate bodies. The one can prescribe no rules concerning the commerce or currency of the nation. The other is in several respects the arbiter of commerce, and in this capacity can establish markets and fairs, can regulate weights and measures, can lay embargoes for a limited time, can coin money, can authorize or prohibit the circulation of foreign coin. The one has no particle of spiritual jurisdiction. The other is the supreme head and governor of the national church. What answer shall we give to those who would persuade us that things so unlike resemble each other, the same that ought to be given to those who tell us that a government, the whole power of which would be in the hands of the elected and periodical servants of the people, is an aristocracy, a monarchy, and a despotism? And so again, this is Federalist number 69, written by Alexander Hamilton, March 1788, to the people of the state of New York. in arguing for the ratification of the proposed Constitution.
And I really beg your forgiveness and your forbearance as I read that into the lecture. There's nothing worse than being read to, and a Federalist paper is probably one of the driest there is. But I think you'll agree that if you go back and listen again, or maybe you heard it the first time, especially to what Hamilton is addressing insofar as impeachment and the grounds for impeachment, and what the Founding Fathers were trying to achieve in allowing impeachment for the great magistrate, for the executive, for the president. Secondly, the pardoning powers, which have been all too evident, especially in the last 4 years, the power of the president to pardon, allowing those who helped him, perhaps in malfeasance, perhaps to get off the hook. And so the power of the president to forgive people who help him in criminal acts was exactly what the Founding Fathers were imagining, why they instituted impeachment. And so, not for this or that, I am totally, absolutely nonpartisan, non-political, but with an eye to the presidency, especially following the administration of President Trump, I think Federalist 69 and its discussions are all the more relevant in our conversation.
Now, we go back into our examination of the president's hats to see how these different elements drawn out in Federalist 69 pencil out. And again, this is Alexander Hamilton. Now, just a quick aside. This is to the people of the state of New York. He's convincing the people of the state of New York specifically to ratify the Constitution. And so what he's going to do is he's going to argue to a New Yorker, and he's going to use New York's specific political experiences to make his point. So we see then that the Madisonian model intended that the president be limited in absolute power. In that list, now that was the concluding paragraph of Federalist 69. And so what Hamilton's doing is he's going through each one of those specific arguments, each one of those institutional characteristics, to compare them to the monarch, to the King of Great Britain, and one by one discounts them by the Madisonian model, the balance of power. You with me thus far? Deep breath. Any questions? So, the next hat that the president wears is Commander-in-Chief. And so, as Commander-in-Chief, the President of the United States directs unprecedented military power. Hamilton just said in 69, this is mitigated. This is controlled by the fact that Congress raises and supports an Army and a Navy and makes rules for their governance. So when we get to Teddy Roosevelt here in a minute, this is going to become really important. But let me give you a more recent example. Bill Clinton, in 92, in order to gain electoral votes, promised that if elected president, he would do away with the prescription against gays and lesbians serving in the military. I don't know if anybody remembers this. I'm probably dating myself. But he doesn't have that power. The president doesn't have the power to do away with the prescription against gays and lesbians serving in the military. The rules governing the military are institutionally given to Congress. And so the president had to go through Congress to try to get them to sign on to his idea. Sam Nunn in the Senate was the lead charge against doing away with the prescription. And so what they came up with was this compromise of don't ask, don't tell. And so we know that we recently did away with don't ask, don't tell a couple of years ago, but it took a good 20 years. So the president as commander-in-chief isn't an absolute. It's qualified. But that being said, remember that the commander-in-chief is the head of all the armed forces. The song that we played is evidence of this. Why is this song the president's song? Because the Department of Defense says so. The Department of Defense, in a piece of regulative created in 1954, hailed to the chief the president's signature song. So these 4 flourishes and ruffles that I was talking about assigned to the president are an Army regulation. This is a military tribute. And it's seen in the lyrics of the song, which you may not have heard. I mean, I kind of went through it quickly. But the one line in red, "Hail to the one we selected as commander," is talking about the president as commander-in-chief. So again, you hear the Marine band playing this song, and it's usually in the context of a civil ceremony or a civil event. I mean, the president isn't coming in full military regalia. He's a civilian in charge of the armed forces. To take the other side of the argument, looking at defense spending, the U.S. versus the rest of the world, we have the United States spending 41% of the global expenditures on defense. In other words, of every penny that's spent in the world on defense, on military spending, the United States is spending 41%. This equated to $645 billion. Yes, ma'am. Yes, and we're going to talk about that. That's a great question. No, don't be sorry. This is beautiful. Thank you. So when we're going to look at how the president asks Congress for appropriations of funds for the military, this is one of the structural and procedural elements that I'm talking about. The president has to go to Congress because Congress is charged with creating the military, providing the funds to run the military. So the president needs to go to Congress. Now, the institutional characteristic is that Congress has the ability to raise money, or the authority to raise money. The president has the authority to use the military. So the process is the president needs to tell Congress how much money he needs to run the military and get the Congress to agree to that. So, yeah, that's the conversation that needs to happen. That's a great question. So, but my point here in this slide is if you're looking at unprecedented military power, the president is at the head of an annual expenditure of $645 billion. So he gets to direct $645 billion worth of military on an annual basis. So it's not the how the money is achieved just now, just the idea that the president directs an armed forces that is a manifestation of $645 billion annual expenditure. That's huge. That in itself is huge. We're talking about the power of the president as commander-in-chief. Now, we know that Congress has the power to declare war. But when was the last time we had a declaration of war? World War II, right, when the Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor. And so that means that Korea, Vietnam, Cambodia, El Salvador, Lebanon, even Iraq and Afghanistan, we've done all these without a formal declaration of war. Now, this isn't in and of itself unconstitutional, and here's how. But what I'm saying is, if Hamilton said that the king was different from the president because the king got to decide to declare war and then use the armed forces, his argument was, yeah, but here Congress declares war and the president used the armed forces. Well, those are now conflated by virtue of the nuclear age. And so in 1945, Congress realized very quickly that the former tradition of coming together and arguing and debating to declare war, while it was constitutional intention, and a good constitutional intention, really didn't fit in the nuclear age. By the time Congress comes together to discuss and debate, the nuclear warheads are already here. There's no time for that. This is 1945. So this is the birth of the atomic age. So Congress gave the president what's called war powers. And it was updated again in 1973. The idea is that the president needs to act quickly. As commander-in-chief, that the president has the duty to protect the nation. The Congress talked about, and political theorists have discussed, the idea of a perfect war and an imperfect war. In a perfect war, you have the time and the bandwidth for Congress to come together and discuss and debate the pros and cons of going to war. In a perfect war, you have the nation behind you. In a perfect war, you have these processes. We have what's known as imperfect war, the idea of an imperfect war, that we may not be able to go through those processes, but my God, we still have to act. And so the imperfect war is answered by the War Powers Resolution that gives the president the authority to use the military for 60 days or with an extension 90 days by congressional authority before Congress can require the president to report to them on his actions or force the president to withdraw the troops. And so the War Powers Resolution has been used to send American troops overseas in Korea, Vietnam, Cambodia, El Salvador, Desert Shield, Yugoslavia, Bosnia, Kosovo, Iraq.
So thus far our examination of the Commander-in-Chief has been at the 30,000-foot level, and it's been looking at the direction from the Commander-in-Chief to the armed services, right? The use by the Commander-in-Chief of the armed services. But as we began this conversation, we were talking about the institutional, structural, and procedural characteristics. Well, if I'm worth my weight in salt, I can't let you off the hook without talking about how the military, in its relation to the Commander-in-Chief, also provides some pluralism, right? We're talking about the different hats of the president and how it contributes to the Madisonian model. The Madisonian model is intended to, well, stop the abuse of power, surely, and diffuse power across many different levels, but also to ensure pluralism, right? This goes back to our Chapter 1, Chapter 2, Chapter 3 conversation. So my approach, then, I want to build on this model and talk about political leaders that have interfered successfully in strategic affairs during wartime or even in operational and tactical matters. So the Commander-in-Chief actually getting into the weeds and telling the generals what to do. However, instead of examining at the macro level or the broad picture, let's focus on the micro level just for a little bit. In particular, my approach would want to seek to explain why conflict between senior military and political officials, either the president or the president's designees, is intense on some occasions while mild on others. What is the pluralism inherent? Well, pluralism evokes conflict. We get this. It is by nature conflict. Conflict is built into the American system. But there are occasions when generals and the White House conduct bitter battles, and others when they cooperate. I argue that service or military culture plays a critical role in civil-military relations. The American military is structured very differently from other governmental groups in the United States, and its members tend to be very loyal to their service and organization as well as to the political leadership. Soldiers, sailors, Marines, aviators, we all share many attributes with civilian friends and colleagues, but those who lead the armed forces and make the key decisions, the senior officers, continue to view the political world through the lens of a military professional. Military professionals look to their chain of command for guidance. In the United States, this means the president, who is the commander-in-chief, and civilian authorities such as the Secretary of Defense, whom the president appoints. Officers expect the president, or the appropriate civilian official, to take the lead and provide them with guidance and, when necessary, orders they must carry out. Each of the presidents since the beginning of World War II has dealt with the military in a different fashion. In some cases, the relationship was cooperative. In others, it was characterized by a high degree of conflict. Why? Well, at this point, the distinction between terms service culture and military culture is in order, looking at the role of the president in his hats. Service culture and military culture are alike in that they share the same general characteristics. However, service culture dictates that members of the military owe primary loyalty to their individual service, not only psychologically, but operationally as well. The term military culture, in contrast, suggests that the armed forces are operating in a joint fashion. The idiosyncrasies of service culture recede into the background, although they never completely disappear in the military culture. This distinction is not unremarkable. It creates a double-edged sword for civil-military relations.
A military that is primarily marked by service culture will show the inefficiencies that result from the four services operating separately. However, from a political standpoint, it will be easier for a president to divide and conquer the services, to play one off against another. Military culture means that the armed forces enjoy the increased efficiency that accompanies more jointness. But it also means that the Joint Chiefs of Staff will be better able to resist efforts by the executive to split them and to get them to fight against each other. Importantly, like political culture, service and military cultures are constantly changing. At one point in time, the military may resist an effort to force them to fight jointly, while at another, such cooperation may seem natural. So, how does the military respond to efforts to change or ignore its service or its military culture? Do the Joint Chiefs of Staff, hereinafter called the Chiefs, interact only when the president is opposing change? Or do they invoke a larger political community when they believe the president is trying to force them to do something that violates their service or military culture? To what degree do they involve other institutions in their battle with the president? I'm thinking about the Iron Triangle. And do they consider such action legitimate? The military is inherently a conservative institution and often resists change. Indeed, I would argue it's probably one of the most conservative institutions in the United States. The occurrence of change in the military is not a critical factor for this lecture. What is critical is the manner in which the president introduces that change to the leaders of the armed forces. Let me repeat that. I'm not suggesting that a president should bow to the wishes of their generals and admirals to avoid conflict. On the contrary, civilian leadership is critical in our democratic system and in our Constitution, and the military expects it. But each president has a choice to make. If he or she fails to provide leadership and violates military culture, conflict will result and potentially intensify. The change imposed by the executive, such as racial integration or joint operations or women serving in combat, and the resulting conflict may have a positive impact on the military. However, the manner in which the change is implemented determines to a certain extent the degree of conflict it creates. So, from the military's perspective, concurrence with military service culture or military culture can be evaluated using these characteristics. First, the presidential leadership style. By presidential leadership style, I have in mind the interactions between the president and the armed forces, as well as the structures and procedures that the president implements to facilitate those interactions. The military expects strong political leadership. However, in the process of being led, the country's senior military officers expect to be consulted by the president and to be granted access to him or her. The president's leadership style may be evaluated in a number of ways, including the extent to which the chiefs are given a meaningful input into the decision-making process, regardless of whether the issue is the military budget or the application of force. Does the president delegate authority to the Secretary of Defense, and if so, does the latter involve the military in the decision-making process? Does the president show respect for them and for the office they hold? Senior military officers fully understand that each administration will be run differently, and they are prepared to adapt to varied leadership styles, but they do not expect to be ignored, disrespected, or micromanaged. Secondly, I think of the service and the military culture described earlier. The concept of service and military culture is often amorphous. In this, we examine four prominent issues related to service and military culture that often arise when the military and civilian authorities, i.e. the president, interact. It is on the basis of these issues that the military evaluates the president's leadership. Well, first is the use of force. When the military is called upon to use force, it prefers a situation in which the following are present: a clear chain of command, clear and unambiguous orders, strategic decision-making, and operational and tactical autonomy. What do I mean by that? The military and its branches welcome civilian involvement at the strategic level, but share less willingly command authority at the operational and tactical levels. The military expects to have its plans approved by senior civilian officials, but it strongly opposes any attempt by civilians to interfere at the levels in which military expertise is the highest. Persuasion is unlikely to overcome service hostility to outside interference. Well, also, we have to bear in mind roles, missions, and resources. What do I mean by that? The military must clearly understand its roles and missions and have the resources necessary to carry them out. The chiefs believe that the military's ability to fulfill its duties will be enhanced to the degree that the president possesses a respect for military expertise. Again, the military is fully aware that for a variety of reasons the White House will want to change force structure as well as roles and missions from time to time. The key to good presidential leadership in this area is for the president to convince the chiefs that he respects their military expertise. Presidential persuasion may have an important impact, but only if military leadership believes the president recognizes its special technical knowledge. The chiefs expect to be tasked with organizing battle plans based on the strategic plans and goals to be decided by the senior civilian authorities. They will, however, resent civilian interference in the planning process if such actions impinge on technical military matters. With input from both the executive, the president, and Congress, the chiefs also expect to play a major role in designing roles and missions. We also have to have responsibility and honor. So personal responsibility and a sense of honor are very important to the military. If you've served in the military, if you're a vet, or if you've known somebody who's served in the military, you'll get this. Indeed, such ideas as duty, honor, and country go to the heart of the military oath. So there is an assumption of personal responsibility. Because the president is the commander-in-chief, the military expects him to assume personal responsibility for the outcome of military operations, both positive and negative, just as the senior military officer in command is expected to assume responsibility for the actions of his subordinates. Attempts by senior civilian officials, including the president, to deflect criticism for a failed military action will cause the military to lose respect for him. There is also an inherent code of conduct. Because the military regards the president as the commander-in-chief, they expect him or her to conform to the same code of conduct that they live by. Although some discretion is involved, gross violations of the code of conduct will lead them to a loss of respect for the president. A loss of respect will undermine the president's authority over the military. And so really, at the heart of it, when you're looking at the president as commander-in-chief, as a hat that he wears, along with all the other hats that we're going to go into in detail in this class, the president can issue orders on any topic to the Joint Chiefs of Staff. However, as anyone who has spent any time in a bureaucracy knows, receiving the willing cooperation and compliance of the military requires more than simply issuing an order. One of the main considerations in the minds of military officers when they choose to disobey is whether or not they think that they can get away with such behavior. I don't deny that such considerations may play an important, if not major, role. Indeed, one cannot rule out the possibility that an officer will refuse to obey the president or at least comply with minimal effort, as illustrated by a number of examples since 1940, the president may decide to punish that individual. I'm thinking of MacArthur. However, I argue that a more critical consideration is the style of presidential leadership. Conflict between the president and the Joint Chiefs of Staff is exacerbated by the administration's refusal to respect military culture, even if the president's policy may be a wise decision in the long run, as it was with the integration of African Americans into the military. In a nutshell, in spite of policy disagreements between the chiefs and the president, the less the degree to which his or her relationship with the chiefs coincides with the characteristics outlined, the greater the degree of conflict will be between the two. The president does not have to act in accordance with all or any of these characteristics. Sure, but a clear violation of several of them will increase the possibility of conflict and undermine his effectiveness in achieving his goal.
And so this concludes our look at the president as commander-in-chief. However, this hat is going to come back again and again and again through our lecture today as we juxtapose how the hats combine to benefit the president or to detract from the president's powers, all at the heart of the Madisonian model and pluralism in the institutional, structural, and procedural characteristics of the office. So next, we turn our attention to the president as chief diplomat.
And these are institutional, structural, and procedural elements. So, as chief diplomat, the president is the main architect of American foreign policy. He's able to craft treaties and receive ambassadors. In this, he acts as the U.S. spokesperson to other nation states. And this is the Constitution, Article 2, Section 2, Clause 2, and. So what we're looking at then is the ability to craft treaties and the ability to receive ambassadors. Now, crafting treaty needs 2/3 approval by the Senate, the upper chamber. And in Chapter 10, we talked about why the founding generation put the treaty approval authority in the Senate and not in both the Senate and the House. Why they wanted to pit the Senate in particular against the president in foreign relations, so that the Senate would have the power, the authority, the legitimate constitutional place to challenge the president in foreign relations specifically.
As Elmer Plitchie points out in his article, The President's Image as Diplomat-in-Chief, a number of factors complicate understanding the president's image as diplomat-in-chief. The first is the need to distinguish his experience with various types of summitry. These embrace presidential policy making, which coalesces a variety of institutional and personal components, and his implementation of national purposes, interests, and strategies. Also, the foreign policy that is made, both substantive and procedural. Thirdly, personally written and telephonic communications with other heads of state and governments, the president's use of special emissaries to represent him as surrogates at the highest level, visits to the United States by foreign leaders, presidential trips and tours abroad, and summit meetings and conferences, including East-West conclaves with the leaders of Russia and the People's Republic of China. The image as diplomat of individual presidents may be assessed overall, restricted to any one of these specific forms of diplomacy, or applied to a particular historic or memorable moment of presidential involvement, of which I'll give you a couple of examples here in a second. The president, therefore, may engender varying or even competing characterizations in the perceptions of the people, the media, foreign leaders, and the experts. A second complicating factor is the confusion of image with presidential popularity or approval by the people that we'll be talking about when we talk about the president as chief citizen. But more so, another complicating factor is respect, or a more fundamental esteem, and prestige, which is a long-lived admiration, renown, or greatness. Image
may be mistakenly equated with prestige or prestige with political power and respect, but usually a clear distinction is drawn between popular plaudits and long-lived greatness. Often, popularity is deemed to connote prestige, when, in fact, the president, as America's ranking diplomat, may be popular simply by not giving offense, or by not being confronted with serious foreign difficulties or crises. In practice, a president may be popular without being respected, and he may be esteemed without being prestigious. Also, he may be respected without necessarily being liked or admired by his contemporaries, without becoming historically noteworthy. Specifically, though, in the conduct of foreign affairs as chief diplomat, understanding is further complicated by the need to distinguish the image of the president from that of the country, from its policies and its actions, from the government at large, and more precisely from the presidency as an institution. Although these are all interrelated, they are usually epitomized both nationally and internationally by the president. Nevertheless, the repute of the United States might be more or less favorable than that of a particular president, and the latter may be more but sometimes is less prestigious than that of the presidency. In terms of international consequence, however, the image of the country overrides that of the individual president, even though, conversely, the stature and actions of the latter may enhance that of the nation. We understand that each president is unique, right, and administers the presidency in their own way. At the beginning of our nation, the image of the United States and its government was uncertain, and the presidency lacked acknowledged prestige. But George Washington lent his personal eminence to the office. Historians confirm this, observing that the first president prized and maintained the intrinsic dignity of the presidency and sought to render it respectable, that he energized executive authority while eschewing personal regal ambitions, and that he brought such qualities as integrity and honor to his tasks, thereby transposing his personal image of the office. In Presidential Greatness, diplomatic historian Thomas Bailey contends that he was perhaps the only man in the history of the presidency bigger than the government itself. Since the earliest 20th century, the process has been reversed. When a new president is sworn in, he now falls heir to the power and prestige of a great office. The question is whether he has the capacity to measure up to it and take advantage of its potential. Complexity of the presidential image as chief diplomat also results from variations in specific features it reflects in this hat that he's wearing. These may include the president's character, qualities, and personality, or they may encompass his goals, ideas, actions, and accomplishments. From the perspective of those doing the judging, interpretation may focus largely on personal credibility and charisma. Some assessments issue from the presidency itself, and others are attributable to the individual president. Within the context of such factors, perception is colored by the objectives, motives, and concerns of those that influence both the process of communicating impressions of the president, especially the media, as we talked about in Chapter 6, and the disposition and emotions of those affected by them. Finally, in coping with the complexity of the presidential image as chief diplomat, it must be realized that it is elusive and subjectively determined by individual evaluators, whether they be contemporary or historical. Even presidential popularity, though empirically measurable, is based on the opinions of those who express themselves. Other contemporaneous appraisals continue to live in history, while others emerge from reflective reassessment long after the president has passed from the scene. The resultant image may be positive or negative. The president may be conceived to be a dignified chief of state, an innovative policymaker, an imaginative planner, a good administrator, a gracious host, an able negotiator, a determined leader, or a vigorous summiteer. On the other hand, he may appear to be dilatory, feeble, ineffective, or even inept or devious. Often favorable regard bears testimony to practical accomplishment. When the rubber meets the road, what got done? While an unfavorable characterization may derive from either the achievement of a competitor that impinges on United States interests or what in the long run may be viewed as a failure. Considering the presidential image as chief diplomat, in terms of theoretical analysis, for the purposes of our class today, for the purposes of this lecture, it's really possible to envision a variety of possibilities, folks. These range from focus on such primary alternatives as general international relations or foreign affairs theory, such as international power wielding, decision-making, negotiation and bargaining, problem-solving and conflict resolution, and the essence of diplomatic practice, such as differentiating among the four fundamental levels of diplomacy: the traditional or professional, as distinguished from higher ministerial and summit levels on the one hand, and from technical diplomacy by the experts, to theoretical parameters of operational foreign relations functions, the nature and the implementation of the presidency, and the more limited presidential diplomatic role. Thus, analysis may be directed towards such functional correlations as external, internal, or foreign-domestic interaction, or more precisely, toward linkage politics. What is the politics behind the president's actions? The theoretical pivot may be the presidency itself, concerning which possibilities encompass concern with presidential power, functions, responsibilities, the professional and personal qualities essential for effective performance as diplomat-in-chief, and the fulfillment of the president's personality and achievement, including attempts to prognosticate and measure presidential success. On the other hand, attention may be narrowed to examine the conjectural basis of presidential role analysis and assessment, encompassing the individual president's projected capability, his political prowess, and such particularized diplomatic activities as the promotion of national interests, foreign policy formulation and enunciation, representation abroad, direct communication with foreign leaders, negotiation of agreements, leadership of the people, and national and international consensus building, together with attempts to determine predictability. And so, as I'm going to suggest here in a second with three examples, history abounds with a myriad of illustrations of individual presidential images, right? They encompass general depictions, methods or style of operation, maybe some worthwhile quotes, personal characteristics, individual actions, and even nicknames, right? To illustrate, President Washington is remembered as the father of his country. Lincoln is remembered as the great emancipator. Jefferson, Polk, and McKinley are memorable as territorial expansionists, and Wilson was the crusader for a better world. In foreign affairs, noteworthy images are related to the era of good feeling under President Monroe, the spirit of a new internationalism and self-determination of peoples under Wilson. What about the good neighbor in Franklin Roosevelt, or the containment of communism with Truman? Even Carter and the international promotion of human rights. Well, presidents are also identified with individualized appellations, some initiated by themselves and others devised to characterize them, such as international non-involvement with Presidents Washington and Jefferson, or manifest destiny with James Polk. We have gunboat diplomacy with Teddy Roosevelt, open diplomacy with Wilson, and East-West rapprochement with Richard Nixon. They're also known for catchy expressions, right? Like speak softly and carry a big stick with Theodore Roosevelt. We must be impartial, neutral, in thought as well in action, and make the world safe for democracy, said Woodrow Wilson. How about a return to normalcy with Harding, and all we have to fear is fear itself, and making America the arsenal of democracy with Franklin Roosevelt? We remember Truman with the buck stops here, and let us never negotiate out of fear, but let us never fear to negotiate, said John Kennedy. Let us reason together, said Lyndon Johnson. Even Reagan, who is quoted as saying, it takes two to tango. Well, all of these reveal something about the man in the White House and color his popular and historical impression. We understand from our conversation in Chapter 6 that the public media play a leading role in molding a president's image, especially his image as chief diplomat. The televised presidential press conference, a formal address or debate, occasional fireside chat or commentary, and other methods of communicating directly with the public via the press, radio, television, even now Twitter, have become commonplace. Presidents now are constant public performers, and their public image is projected into millions of American homes to marshal favorable response and support. Whatever the president does, wherever he goes, whoever he sees, and whatever he says is grist for the news and comment. He is the epicenter of a massive and incessant image-molding campaign via the media, and concomitantly his participation in diplomacy at the summit level has become a major aspect of the process and provides him with opportunity to influence that perception. And the use of the president as chief diplomat and his role on the international stage provides a great opportunity to achieve that. For example, President Eisenhower enjoyed one of his best approval ratings in 1953 after the Korean truce was signed, and again shortly after the Geneva Summit Conference in 1955. But it decreased nearly 20 points when the Soviet government launched its first Sputnik 2 years later. Surprisingly, President Kennedy attained his highest popular endorsement in April 1961, following the unsuccessful Bay of Pigs invasion of Cuba, and, except for his initial valuation, President Ford's greatest popularity was achieved at the time of the Marquez seizure off the coast of Cambodia and the dramatic rescue of its crew in 1975. These and the Truman experience at the outset of the Korean War confirm the generalization that public opinion often rallies behind the president when the United States is active or challenged abroad on matters that impinge on important national interests or it is threatened by force. Focusing more directly on the president's image in the conduct of foreign relations, it is not unique to relate it to his possession and controlled wielding of executive power and authority in world affairs. Years before he entered the White House, Woodrow Wilson wrote that one of the president's greatest powers is his control, which is very absolute, of the foreign relations of the nation. Harold Lasky, an eminent British political scientist, has characterized the presidency as the supreme political office in the United States and called the president the authoritative exponent of the nation's foreign policy. In his study of the modern presidency, Grant McConnell, although acknowledging certain constraints, observes that the presidency is an open mantle for anything its occupant might choose to do with it. And Clinton Rostier contends that leadership in foreign affairs flows from the president or it does not flow at all. Subject to some legal and political restrictions, the president constitutionally has a freer hand in international than in internal or domestic affairs. He's less inhibited by the competing power and influences that permeate the Madisonian model, this domestic governance where pressure groups are less pervasive and perhaps more fundamental, the overriding import and impact of national interest and security are more compelling. But often problems of foreign relations are more complex, less controllable, because they're conditioned by the unilateral actions of other countries and are more protracted and time-consuming, and at times they're also more critical. So, again, the perception of the president's conduct as diplomat-in-chief may confirm or differ from his general image, or that concerned with his handling of internal problems. The president's image and prestige, especially in this new century, also may be influenced by his direct participation as diplomat-in-chief, by his pragmatic functioning in a personal diplomatic capacity, in addition to designing and managing his foreign relations objectives and policies. Usually, media commentary is complimentary, sometimes even euphoric, at the successful conclusion of a major summit venture, such as hosting well-known foreign dignitaries, being acclaimed at state receptions abroad, getting other powers to agree to important United States policy propositions, engaging in serious conferral, mediating in international disputes, or concluding or simply signing major international agreements. These may add luster to his stature, even though they are not always reflected in public sampling. Another generalization of consequence is that summit diplomacy enjoys some inherent advantages that impinge on the image of the president and affect his popularity. Several aspects of presidential diplomacy lend themselves well to enthusiastic media treatment and favorable public reception. Because many summit developments are intrinsically dramatic and newsworthy, members of the media are relieved of the necessity to fabricate interest in them. Little needs to be done, for example, to stimulate attention on such events as President Wilson's widely heralded visits to 4 European capitals, Paris, London, Rome, and Brussels, at the time of the Paris Peace Conference negotiations at the end of World War I. Or President Roosevelt's portentous meetings with Prime Minister Churchill and Generalissimo Stalin during World War II, or Queen Elizabeth's colorful state visit to the United States in 1957, Premier Khrushchev's meeting with the president in Washington and Camp David 2 years later. Well, the same may be said of President Kennedy's electrifying speech in Berlin in 1963, President Johnson's Asian tour and attendance at the Manila Conference in 1966, or you may be aware of President Nixon's dramatic trips to Peking and Moscow in 1972, and President Carter's participation in the negotiation and signing of the Camp David Accords. And of course, we know President Trump, and we know President Trump's visit to the North Korean leader garnered great media interest, both domestically and internationally. So, on the basis of general review, when we look at the president as chief diplomat, it can be held that the president's popular image and prestige as diplomat-in-chief tend to be deceptive, and in many respects are unpredictable. He may be well regarded, though not honored by his contemporaries for many things, including but not limited to his international experiences. Short-range assessments in the popular mind may have little determining effect on his long-term repute, which is based on factors that withstand the test of time. Of 20th century presidents, it will probably be agreed that only Theodore and Franklin Roosevelt were really natural leaders. The egalitarian spirit of American life, noted from Alexis de Tocqueville on, produces a widespread inclination to diminish the stature and reputation of any man who becomes eminent. I call this the tall poppy syndrome. And they're likely to be acknowledged, if at all, only after they're dead. And it needs to be added that having media that often harbor a critical, some would say even adversarial, attitude toward some political leaders, especially those in the White House, it is only after the passage of time that a balanced appraisal of the president's true image, prestige, and leadership can be determined, and even they remain mutable. So, it's important to note how, since World War II, as the United States became more active in world affairs, presidents have been concerned with peacemaking and peacekeeping, and the degree to which their personal involvement in efforts to foster these objections have taken them to international activities. As diplomats-in-chief, They have propounded policy, undertaken extensive top-level communications with other world leaders, appointed dozens of special personal envoys and roving emissaries, and participated directly in conferral and negotiations. There can be little question that their diplomacy at the international level and their immediate image and their long-range prestige are related. So, assessing the matter then of presidential notability, one of my favorite authors, Henry Kissinger, declares that to meet the test of the president's encounter with history, and it is not unreasonable to add to burnish his image, so far as foreign affairs are concerned, a statesman must perceive the trend of events and put it into the service of his purposes and set lofty goals, but assess unemotionally and realistically the resources with which he must cope. He must look destiny in the eye without flinching, but also without attempting to play God. He also must avoid squandering America's credibility, educate the people to the permanent challenge of responsible American involvement in the world, and establish a psychological foundation that positions the United States as the defender of a structure of peace open even to our adversaries. And yet, the lasting image of the president as diplomat-in-chief and his international craftsmanship will depend on how, when, and by whom he is judged, and by how and when the history is written and who recounts it.
I give you my first example, which is George Washington and the Creek Indian Treaty. So we're talking about George Washington, right? He comes into the Senate, and he wants the Senate's approval on a treaty that he's hammered out with the Creek Indians. And what the Constitution says is advice and consent of the Senate. And so advice means, in George Washington's mind, now he's making this stuff up, right? The Constitution is newly minted. George Washington is trying to figure out how the system works, and he's setting precedents. Every time he gets out of bed, he sets precedents. This is the first president. So he goes to the Senate with the treaty that he's crafted, and he sits down and he proceeds to read it to them. Now, he's assuming that once he's read it to them, they're going to approve it. I mean, he's George Washington, for God's sakes, right? And there's no question. So his advice and consent idea is to sit down and read it to the senators. The senators, realizing that they're not going to be able to have a free discussion about this treaty with George Washington in the room, said, "Thank you very much, Mr. President. We'll take it under consideration." They took the treaty, and they invited George Washington to leave. And so going back to the idea of why George Washington never again set foot in the Senate chamber was a direct result of this specific incident. And the State of the Union address, again, being delivered in an envelope instead of in person, speaks to this event as well. What about Bill Clinton and Fidel Castro going to a baseball game? So in 1999, Bill Clinton authorized the Cuban national baseball team to play an exhibition game against the Baltimore Orioles. So if you're a baseball fan, this will be old hat to you. And so Bill Clinton took a lot of heat for this, but this was in his role as chief diplomat. He was able to relax the prohibition against Cubans coming to the United States. And when Nixon opened China, they called it ping pong diplomacy because there were ping pong games, right? Ping pong, table tennis, right? You may remember, you may not. This is old ancient history to most of you guys, but Nixon opened China by first creating an exchange of ping pong teams. And so it's through sport that this conversation between these two great nations began. Clinton did the same thing, but he used baseball. And so in 1999, then, we had two exhibition games where we went to Cuba and then Cuba came to Baltimore. And by virtue of these games, then, in the next year, in 2000, Bill Clinton and Fidel Castro met at a UN summit, and the embargo against Cuba began to be slowly lifted. Bill Clinton shook Fidel Castro's hand. Now, bear with me. When you talk about the president's constitutional authority to receive ambassadors, this was a huge constitutional question. It was almost a crisis, you may remember. Does the president shaking Fidel Castro's hand constitute diplomatic recognition of the state of Cuba? This had to go through a lot of adjudication. The Senate had to hammer this out a lot. Does a simple handshake mean acceptance of a nation state?
They argued finally that it wasn't, that it was a friendly exchange between two individuals and that the president wasn't acting as head of state. But imagine then the authority. So when the president receives an ambassador, what we're talking about is something much more than an honorific event. If the president receives an ambassador, that's tantamount to saying that ambassador's credentials are valid. If I receive you as the representative of a nation, what I'm saying is that your credentials that make you that representative are valid, which means that that nation is valid. And so if the president perhaps, for example, were to receive the ambassador of Taiwan, would we then recognize the existence of the state of Taiwan? Which we don't. We trade like hell with them, but because of the complex issues with China, we don't acknowledge this political existence of the state of Taiwan. So the president simply receiving an ambassador is fraud. And this is because of the constitutional, institutional elements of the presidency receiving ambassadors. So, well, James Polk is a good example. So this is out of The Transformation of Global Geopolitics. Polk is the quintessential example of the ruthless, unconscionable, expansionist president which every power structure turns to as it stretches its power tentacles toward the seizures of weaker and less defensible neighbors. He is the most successful proponent of Americans' manifest destiny, a doctrine which, like other predestination philosophies, carried a semi-divine halo. And he insisted that America was preordained to rule the North American continent from coast to coast. Since might makes right, American history has scarcely paused to condemn his unsavory machinations, but in 1845, America was a long way from its final West Coast goal. Looking at the president then in helping determine foreign policy as an institutional, structural, and procedural element, must a power structure always expand until it reaches its natural geographic frontiers? The American 19th century expansion did appear achievable. When it continued to push, it eventually ran up against a power structure which was capable of pushing back. So Polk experienced this in the Oregon Territory that was claimed both by American and British interests. And there were those in America, and particularly at the Democratic Convention in 1844, who screamed 5440 or fight. That may sound familiar, meaning if Britain doesn't give us what we want, we'll take it by force. Polk was brilliant as well as ruthless in his development of foreign policy, and he chose to negotiate the present boundary line between Canada, then British America, and the United States. So Polk determining geographic boundaries by virtue of treaty with Britain. How else can we look at the president as chief diplomat? I said that part of being head of state means representing the nation as a symbol, as a person. And so the president conducting foreign travel, appearing on the world stage, perhaps with other leaders in the G8 or the G20, or being received as head of state by other heads of state. These are all examples of the president in his role as chief diplomat. And so if we look at foreign travel as a quantitative manifestation of the president as chief diplomat, we can follow, well, the historic bouncing ball to see the ascent, to see the increase in this presidential mandate. So we look at Truman starting out in the 1940s, right? And so this poor guy comes into office upon the death of Franklin Roosevelt, right, in his fourth unprecedented term. And he's got World War II to fix. He's got World War II to wrap up. He's got the birth of the nuclear age. He's got enough on his plate. He doesn't have time to travel. He's more focused on effecting an end to the war. Eisenhower, who was a general in World War II, was very popular in Europe, is going to be going overseas almost 5 times as much as Truman, his predecessor. Why? What is Eisenhower trying to do? As chief diplomat, he's trying to force the Maastricht Treaty or the Marshall Plan. That plan that's going to result in the creation of the European Union. In reconstructing Europe and trying to get Europe to bend toward the West, to bend toward the United States, what better spokesperson on the world stage than Eisenhower? And so his trips overseas are indicative of his role as chief diplomat. As you know, he was very young. He was very vibrant. He was well seen both in the United States and in Europe. He had a beautiful young wife, beautiful family. He was very charismatic. He had a lot of star power. And so sending him overseas as this young vision of America's future was in his role as chief diplomat. Johnson's got enough on his plate. He's got civil rights. He's got the Great Society. He's got the beginnings of the Vietnam War. Johnson doesn't have time to go overseas. There should be a correlative effect on his domestic travel and his domestic appearances, because if he's not going overseas, he should be doing something, and we'll see that in a little bit. Nixon, Ford, Carter, Reagan, pretty much standard at about 14, 15 days a year, but then what the heck happens? Bush, George Herbert Walker Bush the father, and Clinton. So we're looking at 1988, starting in the 1990s. What the hell's going on? The fall of the Berlin Wall, the fall of the Soviet Union. And so we're looking at the former Soviet satellite states, and the president going to these countries to bend them to the Western Hemisphere, bend them to the West, to NATO, to the European Union, to get them away from the Soviet ideology and incorporate them back into Western Europe.
And then Presidents George W. Bush, Barack Obama, and Donald Trump, foreign travel, overseas travel, reduced significantly following the need of the fall of the Berlin Wall, as exemplified in George Herbert Walker Bush and Bill Clinton's administrations. President Biden's administration will most likely be concentrating on domestic issues, the pandemic, intrinsic racism, the economy, and will probably not have a lot of time to travel.
And so the president then is working to a diplomatic end, using his star power, using his role as head of state and as chief diplomat to represent American interests abroad in these newly freed countries. This is Teddy Roosevelt. And so Teddy Roosevelt and the Great White Fleet. Now, here's the story. Teddy Roosevelt helped broker a peace following the Russian-Japanese War in the late 1800s, the early 1900s, brokering a peace between these two belligerents. And so the idea was that Russia was a balance of power against Britain, France, and Germany, that Japan was a rising star in the Pacific, and that America had interests in both. And so Teddy Roosevelt used his role as head of state and chief diplomat to invite the two belligerents, in this case to Oyster Bay, right, to his home in Oyster Bay to have a summit, to have negotiations. And so he used his leverage to get the Tsar Nicholas II, the one who was assassinated by the Bolsheviks, to send his emissaries, to get the Japanese emperor to send his emissaries. And he hammered out a peace. And so this is the first time that an American won the Nobel Peace Prize. While Roosevelt had always favored the Russians originally and saw the Japanese as troublesome, in the end he saw the benefit of having a strong Japanese presence as a friend in the Pacific theater. But he wanted to remind Japan of America's military power. Teddy Roosevelt, before he became vice president, acceding to the presidency at the assassination of William McKinley, before that, he was governor of New York, but he was also Secretary of the Navy. And Roosevelt was a huge believer in naval power and the effectiveness of naval power. And so Roosevelt wanted to see the United States Navy recreated, bumped up, filled out, used as best as it could be. So what Roosevelt's doing then in the Great White Fleet scenario is threefold. What he's proposing then is to take 16 battleships, 14,000 sailors, to go 43,000 miles, conduct 20 ports of call visits over a 14-month time between 1907 and 1909. And so he's got 16 battleships, newly created battleships, and what he wants to do is he wants more. He wants to go to Congress for appropriations for more battleships, for an even better Navy. He's got 16 now, and that's a good start. So what he's going to do is he's going to send these 16 battleships off on a world cruise. The Great White Fleet, they're called that because they're all painted white, except for some gold scroll work on their bow. They weren't navy gray as they are now, they were white. So the Great White Fleet, sending them on a world tour to bob past Russia and Japan and England and remind the world that the United States, especially after the end of the Spanish-American War, was now a world power. And it had military might, and here's how. So it was actually threefold idea. In his role then as commander-in-chief, what he was doing was testing fleet readiness. I have these 16 battleships. What do we do? What do we have to do to make them effective? What problems would we run into? You want to try these things out in peace, not in war. You want to find out what the problems are now and make your mistakes now so that when we really need these puppies, we'll know what to do. So sending them off on this world cruise, on this round-the-world cruise, is in his role as commander-in-chief. He's looking at fleet readiness. But he also wants to prove the maxim, speak softly but carry a big stick. In this instance, then, we're talking about his diplomatic role. We speak softly, we create peace, we broker peace, but we have a big stick, our military, our Navy in particular. Right? And so the speak softly, carry a big stick idea is his role as chief diplomat.
Now, I don't want to gloss over this too quickly because Teddy Roosevelt's coordination with the Japanese quietly, privately, bespeaks his true intentions. In his book, The Imperial Cruise, James Bradley discusses American policy in the Pacific during the presidency of Teddy Roosevelt and a surrounding secret of diplomatic and congressional missions to Asia conceived by Roosevelt, which would affect United States involvement in Asia. The book also covers a wide array of other cultural factors that loosely relate to this, the largest diplomatic delegation ever sent to Asia in U.S. history. Roosevelt's diplomatic mistakes constituted the original encouragement for Japanese imperialism that ultimately backfired on the United States and led to the war in the Pacific, and acted as a catalyst in the formation of many subsequent events in England, including the Chinese Communist Revolution, the Korean War, and even the current state of U.S.-Asia affairs in the 21st century. It is Bradley's contention that the actions of Roosevelt and the diplomatic cruise in the summer of 1905 actually lit the fuse that would doom more than 100,000 U.S. military to die in the Pacific Theater decades later under another Roosevelt in the 1940s. Though what Bradley describes as Roosevelt's bumbling diplomacy, he describes how Teddy Roosevelt and his emissary, William Howard Taft, turned previously friendly Japanese sentiment actually against the United States, also being duplicitous with the Korean emperor, letting the Korean emperor think that he had United States backing, all the while knowing that Teddy Roosevelt was actually backing Japan. All this in the context of the Japanese-Russo War, where Roosevelt was publicly supporting the Russians and privately supporting the Japanese. But back now to this other cruise, the cruise of the Great White Fleet.
It's going to be a show of force. It's going to help create diplomatic ties, because oftentimes what you do on port visits is you time them with the birthdays of monarchs. So you honor a monarch, you honor a head of state by timing the port visits to celebrate that monarch's birthday, right? So you create these diplomatic ties. You also create personal ties. There's an example of a sailor in Yokohama when there was an arch of paper of some sort that caught on fire, a welcoming arch. And the Japanese flag was hoisted above the arch, that this sailor, this United States sailor, risked his life to go up the flagpole to rescue the Japanese flag so that it wouldn't burn, right? Oh my God, talk about theater, right? And he and his ship and the Navy were lauded for that tribute to the Japanese people. As chief citizen, what Teddy Roosevelt was trying to do was to get Congress to appropriate more money for more battleships.
And they were resistant. Actually, they were so resistant, they didn't want Teddy Roosevelt to send the fleet off on the world tour. A senator, in particular, suggested that they would disappropriate money from Teddy Roosevelt's budget. And Teddy Roosevelt said, I already have the money, come and get it. Literally, we have that. So what he wanted then was for Congress to give him more money. How do you get Congress to do what you want? If you're president, you have your role as head of state, but also chief citizen. So this is what the State of the Union address is about. The president coming on as chief citizen, convincing the people, convincing the nation. In this instance, the agenda is more money for defense. Here's how. Look at this fleet. Isn't it cool? Doesn't it make you feel patriotic? Does it? Tell your congressman. Get your congressman to support the idea of larger naval appropriations. In sending the Great White Fleet off, right, Teddy Roosevelt is acting as commander-in-chief, chief diplomat, chief citizen, and head of state. These four hats are combining. So when do hats combine to help? Well, again, commander-in-chief, that is institutional, chief diplomat, that is institutional, head of state, that is structural, and chief citizen, that is procedural. So Teddy Roosevelt was able to effect this unprecedented diplomatic coup, this Great White Fleet, 14 months, 16 battleships, tens of thousands of sailors as a show of force. And he was able to achieve it because of the combination of these four hats. So